A letter with no words, yet hiding a clue. What could it mean? Welcome to Rust Evidence. I am your host, Silas Wren. Tell me in the comments where you're joining from today. Your voices make this journey unforgettable. Now the story begins. It had rained steadily since dawn, a thin, patient drizzle that clung to the windows of the boulevard Richard Lenoir. Maigret sat at the kitchen table in his apartment, still in shirt sleeves, smoking his pipe with that unhurried air of a man not yet claimed by the day. Madame Maigret moved quietly about, humming under her breath as she laid out bread and butter for breakfast, the smell of fresh coffee thickening the air. The chief inspector was not thinking of police work. He was watching the drops form on the glass, heavy and fat, sliding down in uneven lines until they disappeared at the sill. The streets below looked blurred, softened by the rain. Somewhere a tram rattled past, and then the silence returned, broken only by the hiss of water in the gutters. It was in these moments, between the last crust of bread and the day's first step into officialdom, that Maigret felt most human, most porous to the city around him. The thought of paperwork at the Quai des Orfèvres weighed less than the mood of Paris itself, grey and damp, filled with people who would carry umbrellas awkwardly, whose collars would be turned up, whose shoes would squeak in the puddles. The telephone rang, muffled in the other room. Madame Maigret gave a little start, wiped her hands on her apron and looked at him. He sighed, set down his pipe and went to answer. Maigret. The voice at the other end was hesitant, unsure, almost embarrassed, not one of the brisk commissaires from the prefecture, nor a uniformed sergeant with a report. It was a man speaking softly, with pauses between his words as though he feared to disturb someone nearby. I don't know if I should call you Monsieur le Commissaire. It may be nothing. But there is something odd. Maigret listened, pipe smoke still clinging to his lips, though he had left it behind in the kitchen. The man explained, haltingly, that he had received a letter that morning. Only there were no words written on it. The envelope had been addressed by hand, neatly, but inside was a single folded sheet of paper, entirely blank. He was not a rich man, not a politician, not anyone of note. He owned a modest stationery shop near the Canal Saint-Martin. He had no enemies that he could think of. But something about the letter, its silence, its absence, unnerved him. Maigret said very little, only asked where the man lived and whether he might stop by later in the morning. The voice on the line sounded relieved, though still unsettled. When they agreed on a time. When Maigret returned to the kitchen, Madame Maigret looked at him, not asking but knowing from the way he took up his hat and coat. Another one, she said softly. He nodded, pulled on his heavy overcoat and kissed her cheek. I won't be late, he muttered, though both of them knew it was a promise never kept. On the stairs, Maigret struck a match and relit his pipe. The flame flickered against the damp air. Outside, the rain pressed down on Paris in its usual indifferent way. A letter without words, perhaps nothing at all, or perhaps the beginning of something that would gnaw at him until it gave up its truth. He turned up his collar and walked toward the canal. The rain had softened to a mist by the time Maigret reached the Canal Saint-Martin. The water moved sluggishly between the locks, reflecting the pale facades of the buildings leaning over it, their shutters closed against the damp air. The inspector walked slowly, his pipe clamped in his teeth, the collar of his overcoat turned high. He wasn't hurrying. He never did in the early stages. His work began with looking, letting the atmosphere of a place seep into him until he could almost breathe the lives of those who lived there. The stationery shop was on a quiet side street, a modest glass front with notebooks and ink bottles displayed neatly, as though someone had spent too long arranging them just so. The bell above the door gave a thin, metallic ring when Maigret pushed it open. Inside it smelled faintly of dust and paper, that particular odor of shops where time moves slowly, where customers are few and the proprietor spends hours in silence. A man emerged from behind the counter, middle-aged, with thinning hair and spectacles perched on his nose. His suit was clean but worn at the elbows, and there was a nervous stiffness in his movements as though he'd been rehearsing this moment ever since the telephone call. Monsieur Maigret? He asked, his voice uncertain, almost deferential. Yes, Maigret said, taking off his hat and brushing the droplets from it. You must be Monsieur Vernou. The man nodded quickly. He glanced toward the door as if afraid someone might have followed. Then he gestured Maigret toward a narrow staircase at the back of the shop. Perhaps upstairs, if you don't mind. My wife is at market. We can speak without interruption. The apartment above was as modest as the shop below, a narrow corridor leading to a small parlour with lace curtains yellowed by years of smoke. On the mantelpiece stood a row of framed photographs, stiff family portraits in sepia tones, people dressed formally for occasions long since faded. The place was warm, overheated by a small iron stove that ticked softly as it cooled. Vernou handed Maigret the letter without ceremony. A white envelope, no return address addressed in an even, careful script. Inside, a single folded sheet of paper. Entirely blank, as the man had said, you see, nothing. No writing, not even an initial, Vernou explained, as though the inspector might doubt his earlier story. His eyes searched Maigret's face, hoping to find reassurance there. Maigret held the paper between his fingers, studying it with the same calm he would give to any clue. The stationery was of good quality, slightly thicker than ordinary notepaper, the kind sold in better shops rather than at grocers'. The envelope was plain but had been sealed carefully. Who delivered it? Maigret asked, his voice low, almost casual. The postman. This morning, with the rest of the mail. Nothing unusual. Maigret nodded, letting silence stretch between them. He knew silence often unsettled people more than questions. Vernou shifted in his chair, adjusted his spectacles, cleared his throat. At last, he said, you think it's a joke? A prank? Perhaps, Maigret replied. Have you enemies? The man gave a nervous laugh. Enemies? I sell paper, pens, school copybooks. Who could wish me harm? But Maigret noticed the hesitation, the faint defensive tone. It wasn't hostility, rather unease, as if the question had touched something he would rather not explore. He lit his pipe slowly, filled the room with its familiar earthy smoke, and leaned back in his chair, watching Vernou with half-closed eyes. Your wife, Maigret said after a pause. She saw the letter. No, not yet. I told her it was nothing. I didn't want to worry her. Why worry her if it is nothing? Maigret asked gently. The shopkeeper opened his mouth, closed it again, then looked away toward the lace curtains as though the rain outside might provide an answer. It is the silence of it. A page without words. I cannot explain. But it feels like a threat. Maigret understood that tone, the mixture of embarrassment and fear. Ordinary people often sense danger without knowing why. A small thing, easily dismissed, would gnaw at them until they had to seek help. He rose and walked slowly around the room. His eyes passed over the mantel photographs again. A younger Vernou, hair thicker, standing stiffly beside a woman in a plain dress, a family portrait, perhaps a sister or brother, and one photograph of a younger woman alone, her expression serious, almost guarded. The same woman appeared in another photo with Vernou, this time in front of the shop downstairs. His wife, Maigret assumed. He asked, How long have you lived here? 22 years. Since our marriage, the shop belonged to my father. I took it over. And your family? Only my wife. No children. My parents are dead. A brother in Lyon, but we are not close. Maigret returned to his chair, pipe smoke curling in the warm air. He tapped the envelope lightly with his finger. Would you permit me to keep this? Of course. Do you think it means something? Maigret did not answer directly. He slipped the letter into the inside pocket of his overcoat, then stood. Perhaps nothing. Perhaps not. I'll look into it. Vernou seemed both relieved and unsettled by the inspector's calm tone. He followed him downstairs, fussing unnecessarily with the arrangement of notebooks on the counter, as though to disguise his nerves. Outside, the mist had thickened again into a fine drizzle. Maigret lit his pipe under the awning, hands deep in his coat pockets. The little shop looked so ordinary, tucked between a grocer and a locksmith, its window display reflecting the damp light of the canal. Yet there was something he could not name, that clung to the place. He began walking back toward the Quai des Orfèvres, but he was not in a hurry. His mind turned over the details with the same slow patience he gave to all beginnings. A blank letter. Any schoolboy could have slipped such a page into an envelope. But why? Why send silence? At the quay, the corridors smelled of tobacco and damp wool. Clerks moved with bundles of papers. Typewriters clattered in distant rooms. Maigret hung his coat on the stand outside his office, placed his hat carefully on the peg, and sat down behind his desk. He placed the envelope before him, opened it again, studied the blank page under the lamp. The paper's texture suggested quality, perhaps purchased in a shop not unlike Vernoux's. Inspector Janvier knocked and entered, cheerful as always. "Another case, Chief." "Perhaps," Maigret said. "A letter without words," Janvier laughed, assuming it a joke. But Maigret's silence quickly smoothed the smile from his face. He leaned closer. "A threat? Maybe, or a warning, or nothing at all." The inspector folded the paper, slid it back into its envelope, and put it away. He was in no rush. If the letter meant something, it would speak in its own time. He had learned long ago that Paris had its rhythms. Events unfolded slowly. People revealed themselves not when pressed, but when they could no longer endure silence. That evening, after leaving the quay, Maigret stopped at a café near the Pont Neuf. He sat at a corner table with a glass of beer, watching the rain bead on the windows. Students laughed at a nearby table. An old man read his newspaper with lips pursed. A waitress carried plates with weary steps. Ordinary life unchanged, unaware of the blank letter in his pocket. He thought of Vernoux's nervous hands, the photographs on the mantel, the way he had said, "I have no enemies," a little too quickly. There was something fragile there, a tension that had not yet broken. When he returned home, Madame Maigret looked up from her knitting. "Late again," she said without reproach. He kissed her forehead, removed his coat, sat down heavily. She brought him a plate of stew, and they ate quietly, listening to the rain against the windows. Later, as he smoked his last pipe of the night, he found himself wondering not about crimes or motives, but about silence itself. A page without words, like a room where someone had just left, leaving only their absence behind. He let the thought linger until the smoke blurred it, and then he went to bed. The letter lay folded in his overcoat pocket, waiting. The next morning, Paris wore its grey uniform again, the kind of damp, heavy sky that pressed down on the city until even the shutters seemed tired. Maigret left his apartment later than usual, walking slowly along the boulevard. The rain had stopped in the night, but left behind a sheen of moisture on the pavements, a faint smell of wet stone rising from the gutters. He stopped once to light his pipe, cupping the flame against the wind, and stood a moment watching a delivery cart rattle past, the horse steaming in the chill air. He felt the same patient pull he always did when a matter was unfinished, not troubling enough for urgency, but insistent, like a weight in his coat pocket. The letter was there, folded, silent, waiting. At the Quai des Orfèvres, the clerks were already busy. Reports piled on his desk, summons and petty thefts and drunken brawls from the night before. But he pushed them aside with the calm assurance that they could wait. He sat for a long while with the envelope under the lamp, eyes half closed in thought. It was not the paper itself that intrigued him. It was the way Vernoux had looked, the nervous flutter of his fingers, the way his eyes slid toward the window as if someone might be watching. Fear out of proportion to the thing itself, and that was always telling. By mid-morning, he decided to walk again to the Canal Saint-Martin, not to speak to Vernoux directly, but to let the air of the place settle over him once more. He believed in places, their capacity to hold secrets as much as people did. The shop looked the same, notebooks displayed with the same fussy neatness, a half-cleaned pane of glass showing streaks where the cloth had stopped. Vernoux was behind the counter this time, serving a schoolboy who paid for an exercise book, with coins counted one by one. Maigret didn't enter. He walked past with an air of indifference, pipe smoke trailing, his eyes drifting casually over the shop. Across the street, a grocer leaned on his doorframe, watching the drizzle return. Maigret crossed over, bought an apple he didn't particularly want, and lingered with the ease of a man who had all the time in the world. The grocer, stout and red-faced, eyed him curiously. "Busy man, Monsieur Vernoux?" Maigret asked, his tone mild, as though it were only small talk. The grocer shrugged. "Not especially. Books, pens, he has his regulars. Schoolchildren, clerks. It's a quiet shop. He's lived here long? Always, I think. Took over from his father, a serious man, quiet. His wife does the market each morning. No trouble with them, no trouble." Maigret repeated softly, watching the man's face. The grocer hesitated, then chuckled. "Not the sort to make trouble, but perhaps too serious. Doesn't talk much. He keeps to himself. Friends?" Another shrug. "Acquaintances, yes, but close friends. I wouldn't say so. They dine at home. He goes to bed early, a man of routine. Maigret thanked him, took a bite of the apple and strolled further along the canal. Routine, silence, a man of order. Yet a blank page had shaken him enough to telephone the police. Later, he stopped at the locksmith next door to the stationer's. A younger man, with sleeves rolled up and metal filings on his hands, greeted him. He seemed less cautious than the grocer, more willing to speak. "Monsieur Vernou?" he said when asked. "Yes, he's steady. Sometimes a little stiff. His wife is kinder, always greets me when she passes. The locksmith frowned, searching for the right word. He carries a heaviness, as if something sits on him all the time. I couldn't say what. And do they receive visitors? Rarely. Perhaps a relative once or twice. Mostly they are alone." The locksmith leaned on his counter, lowered his voice. "There was something a few months ago. I wouldn't have mentioned it, but since you ask. A man came to the shop late one evening. Tall, well-dressed, not a neighbor," they argued. I heard voices through the wall raised, though I couldn't catch the words. The man left quickly. I never saw him again. Maigret's pipe went out. He struck another match, nodded thoughtfully. "You didn't mention it to Monsieur Vernou?" The locksmith shook his head. "It wasn't my business," and afterward he seemed more nervous than usual. Maigret thanked him, then walked back slowly along the quay. His thoughts gathered like smoke. A blank letter arriving after months of unease, after a quarrel with a stranger. It was not enough to call it a case, not yet, but it was enough to keep him from dismissing it. At noon he returned to the Quai des Orfèvres. Inspector Janvier was waiting, amused by his absence. "Chief, there's a burglary report from Montparnasse that—" "Later," Maigret said simply. He sat down, filled his pipe, and let the silence stretch until Janvier, half-smiling, retreated. In the afternoon, Maigret decided on a quiet tactic. He walked again to the stationery shop, this time stepping inside as though only a customer. Vernou greeted him with surprise that he quickly tried to disguise. "A packet of envelopes," Maigret said, choosing at random. Vernou fetched them, his hands trembling slightly as he placed them on the counter. Maigret paid, lingering just long enough to let his eyes rest on the man's face, his nervous mouth. "You've remembered something?" Maigret asked casually, as though it were of little importance. Vernou shook his head too quickly. "No, nothing. Only the letter." Maigret pocketed the envelopes, gave a polite nod, and left. He did not press. Pressing too soon only closed doors. That evening, at home, he recounted little of the day to Madame Maigret. She listened while preparing supper, nodding gently as he described the letter and the anxious stationer. She said nothing until the plates were set, and then she remarked almost idly, "A letter with nothing on it." Perhaps someone meant to write but couldn't. Sometimes silence says more than words. Maigret looked at her with a faint smile. She was right more often than she knew. Silence as confession, as hesitation, as refusal. The next morning he asked Janvier to make discreet inquiries, see if there's been any complaint, any unusual visitor, anyone who knows Vernou beyond the shop. Janvier, eager as always, nodded and disappeared. By afternoon he returned with little to report. Nothing official. No debts recorded. No trouble with the police. But one neighbor mentioned the wife seems anxious these days. She walks quickly, doesn't stop to talk, keeps her eyes down. Maigret listened, puffed at his pipe, said nothing. He thought of the photograph on the mantel, the serious woman standing beside Vernou. Anxiety there too, hidden in plain sight. That night he lingered again at the café by the Pont Neuf, watching the reflections of the street lamps in the wet pavement. A letter without words, a quarrel with a stranger, a nervous man and his anxious wife. He let the pieces drift in his mind, not forcing them, only waiting for them to settle into their own pattern. He believed they would in time. They always did. They always did. And while the city moved indifferently around him, Maigret sat in silence, patient, the smoke of his pipe curling upward like a question, with no answer yet formed. The rain had returned by the following morning, heavier now, falling in sheets that blurred the outlines of the city. Maigret stood at the window of his office, pipe in hand, watching the Seine move sluggishly under the Pont Saint-Michel. The river swelled against its stone embankments, dark and restless. His desk behind him was piled with reports waiting for signatures, but he let them rest there. The blank letter weighed more in his mind than a dozen burglaries. It had the silence of something unfinished, something waiting. Janvier appeared at the door with a file, cheerful despite the weather. "Chief, I made some inquiries about Vernou's wife. Her name is Yvette, born in Montargis. No criminal record, nothing unusual. She has a cousin who lives across the river, but they don't see each other often. Otherwise she keeps to herself." Maigret nodded, saying nothing, his gaze still on the swollen river. Janvier shifted awkwardly as if waiting for more. At last Maigret turned, tamped the tobacco in his pipe with a thick finger. "And among the neighbors?" "A few remarks. Some think she looks unhappy. Others say it's only her nature. But one neighbor mentioned she sometimes goes out in the evenings without her husband. She says it's for errands, but—" Janvier shrugged. The inspector's eyes narrowed slightly, though he made no comment. He dismissed Janvier with a nod and sat down heavily in his chair. He had seen enough unhappy wives to know their silence often concealed more than complaints. He thought again of the photographs on the mantel, the woman's serious expression, the way her eyes avoided the camera. Perhaps the letter was meant for her rather than for her husband. Or perhaps it was her silence he had sensed, not his. That afternoon, despite the rain, he walked again to the Canal Saint-Martin. The shop looked the same, windows fogged slightly by the damp. Vernou was behind the counter, his head bent over a ledger. He looked up as Maigret entered, startled, then quickly masked it with a nervous smile. "Inspector, I didn't expect—" Maigret lifted a hand gently. "Only passing by. I thought I'd step in." He wandered along the shelves, fingering the notebooks, the pencils lined neatly in boxes. The shop smelled of ink and dust, a smell that clung to childhood classrooms. Vernou fidgeted behind the counter, unable to find ease in Maigret's silence. "Your wife is well?" Maigret asked suddenly, turning a box of pens in his hand. Yes, quite well," Vernou replied quickly. Too quickly. His eyes darted toward the staircase leading upstairs. "Will she be returning soon?" "Later. She has errands." His voice was stiff, rehearsed, as though each word had been weighed before speaking. Maigret placed the pens back on the shelf, nodded, and made no further comment. He bought a newspaper, though there was nothing in the shop he couldn't have bought elsewhere, and left with his slow, heavy step. He lingered under the awning outside, striking a match for his pipe. From where he stood, he could see the staircase through the shop door, just a narrow, shadowed glimpse. He imagined Yvette Vernou moving quietly above, the creak of the floorboards under her feet, her eyes glancing toward the street with the same unease as her husband's. When he returned to the quay, Lognan was waiting with his usual sour expression. "Another of your mysteries without a crime, eh, Maigret?" he muttered, half mocking. "We're chasing blank paper now while real thieves go free." Maigret only grunted, not rising to the bait. He knew Lognan's bitterness too well, his perpetual feeling of being overlooked. But the remark stayed with him. Was it only blank paper, or had he allowed his instincts to wander too far from the solid ground of evidence? That evening he stopped again at the café by the Pont Neuf, a ritual now as though the silence of the letter drew him there. He sat at his usual table, beer glass wet with condensation, watching the rain wash across the cobblestones. Students shouted in the back room, their laughter muffled by the walls. A woman passed outside with her umbrella turned inside out by the wind, struggling against it with a half laugh, half curse. Ordinary lives unchanged, yet he felt the thread of something fragile pulling through them, leading back always to the little shop on the canal. The next morning, Madame Maigret mentioned the matter again while he buttered his bread. "And this man, the stationer, did he look you in the eye when he spoke?" she asked. Maigret frowned, considering. "Not often," he admitted. "Then he is hiding something," she said simply, pouring his coffee. "But perhaps it is not what you think." Her words lingered with him as he walked once more to the canal. The rain had lightened into a steady drizzle. He passed the grocer, who gave him a polite nod, and paused again near the locksmith's. The young man greeted him with a smile. "Has Monsieur Vernou seemed different since yesterday?" Maigret asked casually. The locksmith thought for a moment. "More tense, perhaps. He closed the shop early last night. The shutters were drawn before dark. That is unusual. And Madame Vernou?" The locksmith shook his head. "I didn't see her." Maigret nodded, thanked him, and stood for a long while watching the shop across the street. He had no proof, no crime, only the faint unease of silence pressing at the edges of ordinary life. but he trusted that unease. It was the same pressure in the air before a storm. Later in the afternoon, he stepped once more into the shop. Vernou started visibly this time, as if caught in some private thought. Maigret said nothing at first, only wandered the shelves again. At last he remarked in his deep, even voice, "It's a strange thing, monsieur, to send a letter without words, almost as if the silence itself were the message." Vernou's face tightened. He opened his mouth, closed it, then forced a smile that did not reach his eyes. Perhaps. Or perhaps it was only a foolish joke. Perhaps, Maigret said, his tone giving nothing away. He bought another packet of envelopes he did not need, paid and left without looking back. That night in his apartment, he smoked his pipe longer than usual, the room hazy with the blue-grey smoke. Madame Maigret knitted quietly, the click of her needles steady as rain on the window. He thought of the wife's absence, the husband's nervous glances, the quarrel with the unknown man. Each piece by itself was nothing. Together they formed a shadow, indistinct but growing darker. When he finally went to bed, he left the letter on his nightstand rather than in his coat pocket. It lay there in the dim light of the lamp, a single folded sheet of paper without words, its silence louder than any confession. He stared at it until his eyes grew heavy, and still he could not shake the feeling that it was only the beginning. The morning broke grey again, though the rain had paused for now, leaving the streets slick and shining under the pale light. Maigret sat at the kitchen table, his pipe unlit beside the coffee cup, staring at the folded letter on the cloth as though it might speak. Madame Maigret, bustling softly around the stove, cast him a sidelong glance. She knew that look. She had seen it before when a puzzle weighed on him more than the files stacked on his desk. "You've been staring at that piece of paper, as if it could cook your breakfast," she said gently, placing a plate before him. He smiled faintly but did not answer at once. He picked up the letter, turned it over in his thick fingers. "It isn't what it says," he murmured at last. "It's what it doesn't say." "Or who sent it," she added simply, taking her seat opposite him. She buttered her toast with the same steady rhythm as always, but her voice carried a thoughtful note. "People don't send blank pages by mistake. If it isn't a message, then it's a reminder. A reminder can be worse than a threat." Maigret lifted his eyes, studying her face across the table. She wasn't one to meddle, and yet her words often carried more clarity than the reports of his inspectors. A reminder. That word lodged in his mind. He folded the letter carefully, slid it back into the envelope, and tucked it into his coat pocket. At the Quai des Orfèvres, the building hummed with the usual bureaucratic noise, typewriters, phones ringing, the shuffle of shoes on linoleum floors. Maigret walked heavily to his office, lit his pipe and sat behind his desk. Janvier came in with a report, but Maigret waved it aside. "Any word from the neighbors?" he asked. "Nothing concrete," Janvier replied. "The grocer says they're quiet. The locksmith heard an argument months ago, but nothing since. Some say the wife looks anxious, others that she avoids talking." Maigret nodded slowly, letting the silence linger. "Follow the wife," he said at last, discreetly. "I want to know where she goes in the evenings." Janvier blinked but didn't argue. He knew better than to ask why when Maigret's voice had that steady weight. He only nodded and left the office, eager to carry out the order. The afternoon wore on slowly. Rain began again, tapping at the window panes, soft and insistent. Maigret sat in his chair, smoking, thinking of Vernou's quick denials, the way his eyes slid away. He thought, too, of Madame Maigret's remark at breakfast. A reminder. Perhaps the letter wasn't meant to frighten but to recall, to prod some memory best left undisturbed. By evening, Janvier returned, damp from the drizzle, his overcoat beaded with rain. She left the shop at 7, walked quickly, head down, took the tram at République, got off near Gare de l'Est. She went into a small café on Rue de Chabrol. Stayed there nearly an hour. A man joined her, tall, well-dressed. They didn't speak much, but they sat together. Then he left first. She remained a few minutes, then returned home. Maigret listened without comment, tamping the ashes in his pipe. "You recognize the man?" "No, but he carried himself like someone with money. Good suit, polished shoes. Not a neighbor." The inspector leaned back, smoke rising slowly around him. "So there was a man. Not a lover, perhaps, not yet, but someone." The same description the locksmith had given of the visitor months before. Tall, well-dressed, not local. A quarrel then, a quiet meeting now. And between them, a blank letter that had unsettled Vernou enough to call the police. "Keep watching," Maigret said simply, "but no interference. I want to know if it happens again." That night at home he spoke little over supper. Madame Maigret did not press. She only looked at him once knowingly as he smoked after the meal. He felt her quiet presence as part of the rhythm of his thoughts, the way the rain outside was part of the rhythm of Paris. The next day, he walked again to the Canal Saint-Martin. The shop was open, its window slightly fogged from the stove inside. Vernou greeted him with a strained politeness. "Still no more letters?" Maigret asked casually, selecting a box of ink pens from the shelf. "No," Vernou said quickly, too quickly. His fingers tightened on the counter. "If only the one." Maigret studied him through the veil of pipe smoke. "It troubles you still." "It is nothing," Vernou insisted, but his eyes betrayed him, darting again toward the stairs, toward the silence above. Outside, the drizzle clung to Maigret's coat. He walked slowly back toward the quay, turning the details over in his mind. The husband nervous, the wife secretive, the stranger returning, and through it all the silent page, as if marking time. That evening, Janvier came again with news. Same café, same man. They met for nearly an hour. This time they spoke more. She looked nervous, he calm. He touched her hand once across the table. Then they parted as before. Maigret drew deeply on his pipe, the glow lighting his broad features for a moment. He thought of Madame Maigret's words again. A reminder. Perhaps the letter had not been sent to frighten Vernou, but to remind Yvette. To draw her into silence she could not explain. The inspector decided not to act yet. He let the days stretch, watching the rhythm. Each evening she went out. Each evening the man appeared. And each morning Vernou grew more pale behind his counter, more stiff in his movements, as though he sensed something he could not name. On the fourth night, Maigret went himself, sitting in a corner of the café with his beer, his presence unnoticed among the regulars. He watched as Yvette entered, her coat plain, her steps hurried. She sat at the small table near the window, hands folded tightly before her. Minutes later the man arrived, tall, impeccably dressed, his manner smooth. They spoke in low tones. Once she turned her face slightly, and Maigret saw the tension in her jaw, the way her lips pressed together to keep from trembling. The man leaned close, said something, and her eyes filled briefly with tears before she looked away. Maigret felt the silence between them as strongly as if it were a spoken confession. He did not move, did not interfere. He only watched, pipe smoke drifting slowly around him. When they parted, she walked quickly back toward the tram, her head bowed. The man lingered outside a moment, lit a cigarette with unhurried ease, then strolled away into the night, as though he had not left behind a woman trembling in his absence. Maigret left last, his heavy step steady on the pavement. He made no report, filed no papers. He only carried with him the sense of a knot tightening, the pressure mounting silently beneath the surface. At home, he sat long by the stove, smoking in silence. Madame Maigret said nothing, only brought him his glass of beer and touched his shoulder lightly before retiring. He stared at the letter on the table, its blankness more eloquent now than any written word. He thought of a reminder, of a meeting in a café, of a husband's nervous eyes and a wife's trembling mouth. He thought of the inevitability of silence breaking, sooner or later, when people could no longer bear the weight of it, and he waited. The weather had turned mild, though the clouds still hung low and heavy, pressing over Paris as if the sky itself shared the city's secret burdens. Maigret moved through the day slowly, deliberately, his broad frame filling the corridors of the Quai des Orfèvres, his pipe clenched between his teeth. He had learned long ago that investigations were not battles to be won by force, but tides to be waited out. People collapsed under silence, under the weight of their own unease. He felt it coming now, like the strain before a storm finally breaks. In the late morning he returned once more to the Canal Saint-Martin. The street smelled of wet stone, the canal dark and still. The stationery shop stood as always, the same display in the window, the same faint light seeping from behind the glass. Vernou looked paler than ever behind his counter, his eyes shadowed with sleeplessness. When Maigret entered, the man started, his hands fumbling clumsily over the ledger. "Still no letters?" Maigret asked, his voice steady. "No," Vernou replied quickly, too quickly. His lips trembled as he spoke, and he glanced again toward the staircase at the back. Only the one. Maigret lit his pipe, letting the silence expand between them. Smoke drifted lazily in the warm air of the shop. Vernou's hands tightened around the edge of the counter, until the knuckles whitened. The inspector said nothing more. After a few moments, he nodded politely, bought a pencil he didn't need, and left. Across the street, he stood under the awning of the locksmith, watching the shop from the corner of his eye. He had learned to wait, to allow his presence to linger like a shadow, until people broke under its quiet weight. It was near closing time, when the shutters had been drawn and the street had grown dim, that it happened. The door opened and Yvette Vernou stepped out. She wore a dark coat, her movements hurried, her eyes avoiding everyone. She walked quickly down the street, her shoes striking the pavement with a nervous rhythm. Maigret followed at a distance, his heavy step unhurried. She did not take the tram this time. Instead, she turned into a narrow side street deserted in the drizzle and paused under the glow of a lamp-post. Moments later, the tall man appeared, emerging from the shadows with his coat collar turned up, his stride confident. They exchanged no words at first, only a look, a silent exchange that spoke of things left unsaid. Then he leaned close, murmured something, and she shook her head, trembling. From across the street, Maigret watched as her composure faltered. Her hands lifted to her face, covering her eyes, and her shoulders began to shake. The man tried to take her arm, but she pulled back, her voice breaking into sobs that carried faintly in the damp air. She leaned against the lamppost, her body bending under the weight of her emotion. The man stood awkwardly beside her, glancing around, his expression a mixture of impatience and unease. Maigret did not move to intervene. He stood in the shadow, pipe glowing faintly, his eyes calm. He knew this was the moment he had been waiting for, when silence gave way to collapse. At last Yvette lowered her hands, her face pale and streaked with tears. Her voice rose, thin but sharp, carrying more than she intended. "I cannot bear it any longer. You must leave me be." The man hissed something in reply, urgent, commanding, but she shook her head violently. "No, I will not. I cannot." Then abruptly she turned and fled, her footsteps echoing on the wet pavement. The man remained a moment under the lamplight, his jaw tight, before walking swiftly in the opposite direction. Maigret remained where he was until the street grew empty again. Then he turned, his heavy coat swaying as he walked back toward the canal. He did not follow either of them. He did not need to. The collapse had begun, the silence broken. It was only a matter of time now. When he returned home, Madame Maigret looked up from her knitting as he entered, her eyes searching his face. "Something has happened," she said softly. He removed his coat, hung it carefully, and sat at the table. He lit his pipe, exhaled slowly. "The wife," he said simply. "She wept." Madame Maigret nodded as though she had known it would be so. She set down her knitting and brought him his plate, the smell of stew filling the room. They ate quietly, the rhythm of domestic life steady, ordinary, while the storm outside tightened. Later, as he smoked his final pipe of the night, Maigret thought of the lamp-post, the pale face, the trembling shoulders. He thought of the blank letter, a silence that had now burst into words of desperation. He knew that by morning the weight of it would press harder still. One of them would break again, and when they did, the truth would come. He need only wait, as he always did, until the silence of Paris gave way to confession. The city was slow to wake the next morning, the damp air heavy with last night's rain. Maigret left his apartment a little later than usual, his pipe already lit, the collar of his coat turned high. His thoughts moved steadily, not hurried, as though he had all the time in the world, but they circled the scene of the night before, the lamp-post on the deserted street, the tall man's commanding voice, Yvette Vernou's trembling shoulders and sudden sobs. He had seen it often, silence stretched too tight until it broke into collapse. Once it began, the rest would follow inevitably. At the Quai des Orfèvres, he took his seat behind the desk, the familiar clutter of papers before him. He did not open them. The blank letter lay in the drawer, and he pulled it out now, laying it flat under the lamp. It looked the same as always, unmarked, innocent, but the silence of it seemed louder after Yvette's tears. He tamped the bowl of his pipe with a thick finger, filling the office with its earthy smoke. Janvier entered, brisk and smiling, holding a small notebook. "Chief, about the man, he's been seen again at the cafe." I asked around. His name is Lachaume, lives in a hotel near Gare de l'Est, not local to the quarter, but he has been meeting Madame Vernou often these past weeks. Maigret lifted his heavy gaze. What does he do? Nothing clear. He says he deals in fabrics, but the hotel staff hint he's always short of money. Well-dressed, yes, but behind on payments. A man who lives above his means. Good, Maigret said simply, then lapsed back into silence. Janvier hesitated, waiting, before leaving with a respectful nod. In the afternoon, Maigret walked again to the Canal Saint-Martin. The streets glistened, the air cool and damp. He passed the grocer, who greeted him politely, and paused before the locksmiths. The younger man leaned out from his doorway, wiping his hands on a rag. The wife looked unwell this morning, he told Maigret without being asked. She hurried past, head low. Didn't greet anyone. Inside the shop, Vernou stood stiffly behind the counter, paler than ever, his hands folded on the ledger, though he was not writing. He gave a weak smile as Maigret entered. Still no letters? The inspector asked mildly. No, none. Vernou's voice wavered. He glanced again toward the staircase, his eyes heavy with something unsaid. Maigret walked slowly around the shop, his large hands touching the neat rows of paper, pencils, envelopes. Your wife looks tired, he remarked, almost idly. She is well, Vernou replied too quickly. Then, after a pause, he added, She has not been herself these days. Perhaps it is the weather. The inspector lit his pipe, letting the smoke hang in the quiet shop. He said nothing more, only bought another item he didn't need and left. He knew the man was at his limit. Silence pressed on him from two sides, the weight of his wife's secrecy and the weight of Maigret's quiet presence. That evening, Maigret sent Janvier once more to watch the café. By the time he returned, the lamps at the Quai des Orfèvres burned low. Chief, he said, lowering his voice. She met him again. But this time it ended differently. There was a quarrel. She raised her voice, said she wouldn't see him again. People in the café heard. He left angry without even finishing his drink. Maigret nodded slowly, smoke curling from his pipe. And she stayed only a few minutes more, then hurried home. The inspector leaned back in his chair, eyes half closed. It was nearly finished now, he thought. The silence had broken, the threads pulling apart. The man, the woman, the nervous husband, all caught in the net of something small and human, yet heavy enough to crush them. The next morning he returned to the shop early, before the market crowd filled the street. Yvette was behind the counter this time, arranging notebooks in neat stacks. She froze when she saw him, her face drained of color. Vernou was not there, Madame, Maigret said quietly, inclining his head. She nodded stiffly, her hands trembling as they fumbled with the books. He took off his hat, set it on the counter, and filled the air with pipe smoke. He did not question her directly. He only stood there, large and calm, his presence filling the narrow shop. The silence stretched. At last her hands stilled. You know, she whispered, not looking at him. Maigret said nothing. Her eyes lifted then, brimming with tears. It was my doing. The letter. He sent it, but for me. A reminder. I thought it was over. Lachaume, Maigret said gently. She flinched at the name. Yes, he wanted money. He always wants money. He threatened to speak to my husband. He said he would ruin us if I did not help him. Her voice trembled, caught between fear and relief. She pressed a hand to her mouth, then lowered it slowly. I never meant for it to happen. I met him once, long ago, before I married. It was foolish. He never let me forget. I thought he was gone, but he returned. And now, her words broke into sobs. She leaned against the counter, her shoulders shaking. The inspector let her cry. He did not touch her, did not press. He only stood there, pipe smoke curling between them, until the storm of her tears began to ebb. When she could speak again, her voice was faint. My husband doesn't know. He suspects, but he doesn't know. He thought the letter was for him, a threat against him. I let him believe it. I couldn't tell him the truth. Maigret nodded once, heavy and slow. And now? She lifted her head, her face pale and streaked. Now I cannot bear it. Lachaume will not stop. He will come again. He will destroy us. The inspector replaced his hat, nodded again, and left without another word. He walked back along the canal, his step heavy, his thoughts steady. The silence had broken, the hidden truth revealed, not through fingerprints or confessions written in ink, but through the collapse of a woman's heart. the trembling in her voice, the tears that could no longer be held back. At the Quai des Orfèvres, he sat once more behind his desk, the blank letter before him. He thought of what Yvette had said, a reminder. Not a threat to Vernou, but to her. A silent weapon wielded by a man who lived off others, who dressed well but paid nothing, who pressed on her silence until it cracked. He did not rush to make an arrest. That was not his way. He knew Lachaume would return, as all such men returned, pressing for more. And when he did, Maigret would be there, waiting in the quiet, his presence enough to draw the truth into the open. That evening at home, Madame Maigret set supper on the table and studied his face. "You know now," she said softly. "Yes," he replied, pouring himself a glass of beer. She gave a small nod, her eyes calm. "It is always the same. Loneliness, pride, money. Never evil for its own sake." Maigret raised the glass, took a long sip, and let the silence settle around them. The city outside breathed its damp breath against the windows, ordinary as ever, yet filled with unseen griefs. He puffed at his pipe, the glow lighting his face, and waited, as he always did, for the inevitable end. The drizzle returned the next morning, as if Paris itself were conspiring to keep the streets muted and grey. Maigret walked slowly to the Quai des Orfèvres, pipe glowing under the brim of his hat, his thoughts heavy but calm. He did not hurry. He never hurried at this point in an investigation. The truth had already shown itself in fragments, and now it only needed to be allowed to gather shape. He thought of Yvette Vernou's trembling voice, the way her confession had broken free like water breaching a dam. The blank page in the envelope was no longer a mystery. It was a weapon, wielded with silence, meant to remind her of a past she had tried to bury. But knowing this was not the same as proving it. He could not simply drag Lachaume before a magistrate with nothing more than tears to show. At his office, the usual tide of papers and reports awaited, but he waved them aside. Janvier entered, wiping raindrops from his hat. "Chief, I kept a man on Lachaume last night." He didn't go back to the café. Instead, he wandered the boulevards, stopped at 2 bars, drank heavily. Returned late to the hotel, unsteady on his feet. Maigret grunted, smoke rising in slow clouds. "And this morning?" He was seen leaving the hotel. Well dressed again, but agitated. The porter says he argued with someone over a bill. He always pays late, sometimes not at all. The inspector leaned back in his chair, fingers drumming on the desk. He knew the type well. Men who lived on appearances, who wore their suits like armor, but underneath were threadbare. Lachaume's kind always returned to press harder, once their first attempt faltered. He was circling still, and it was only a matter of time before he pushed Yvette too far. By midday, Maigret made his way again to the Canal Saint-Martin. The streets smelled of wet earth and damp bread from the bakery on the corner. The stationery shop stood as usual, its windows steamed faintly from the stove inside. Vernou was at the counter, his movements slow, mechanical. He looked up when Maigret entered, and his eyes betrayed the exhaustion of a man carrying a weight he did not understand. "Nothing new?" Maigret asked in his low, even tone. Vernou shook his head. "No, no letters." He hesitated, then added, "My wife is not well. She hardly eats. She avoids me." His voice cracked slightly, and he looked down, ashamed of having said too much. Maigret nodded, his pipe smoke drifting in the small shop. "Perhaps she carries a burden you do not know," he said gently, not unkindly. Vernou's eyes flickered upward, startled, but he said nothing. That evening, Maigret positioned himself at the café near Gare de l'Est. He chose a corner table, half hidden by the smoke of other patrons, his presence unremarkable among the crowd. The place smelled of beer, coffee grounds, and damp wool. He ordered a glass and waited. Yvette arrived first, moving quickly, her face pale under the harsh lights. She took her seat by the window, folding her hands tightly in her lap. A few minutes later, Lachaume appeared. His suit was immaculate, his shoes polished, but his eyes betrayed fatigue, the strain of a man stretched thin. He sat across from her, leaning forward immediately, his voice low but sharp. From his corner, Maigret watched without seeming to. He saw Yvette's hands tremble as she shook her head, her lips forming the words, "No more." Lachaume's jaw tightened. He reached across the table, fingers closing briefly over her wrist. She pulled back, her chair scraping the floor. Her voice rose, audible now above the murmur of the café. "I have nothing left. You will not have it." Heads turned. A few patrons exchanged glances. Lachaume's face flushed with anger, but he forced a smile, trying to mask it. He leaned in again, whispering something fierce and rapid. Yvette pressed her hands to her face, her shoulders shaking. Maigret set down his glass, his eyes steady. He did not move yet. He let the scene unfold. The pressure was reaching its peak. The man was cornered by his own hunger, the woman by her fear. The silence that had bound them was now cracking in public, before strangers. At last Yvette stood abruptly, her chair tipping slightly. She clutched her coat around her and fled the café, her steps quick and uneven. Lachaume remained a moment, glaring at the empty chair, then rose as well. His smile returned, brittle, as he tossed a coin on the table and walked out into the damp street. Maigret followed at a distance, his heavy coat blending into the crowd. Yvette was already gone, swallowed by the tram. Lachaume lit a cigarette with steady hands, though his jaw worked furiously. He walked toward his hotel, shoulders squared, but the tension in his stride betrayed him. The inspector let him go that night. There was no need to force the moment. He knew Lachaume would return to the shop, to the woman, to the source of money he craved. Men like him could not resist. The following morning, Janvier brought word that Yvette had been seen leaving the market with hurried steps, her basket half empty. Her face was drawn, her eyes red. "She's close to breaking, Chief," Janvier said quietly. Maigret nodded, his expression unreadable. "Keep a man near the shop quietly. When he comes, I want to know." That afternoon, as the rain thickened once more, the word came. Lachaume had been seen entering the shop just before closing. The shutters were half drawn, the street already dim. Maigret walked there slowly, his step heavy on the slick pavement. When he arrived, he did not enter immediately. He stood across the street, pipe glowing in the drizzle, watching the faint light flicker behind the lace curtains above the shop. Voices carried faintly, a man's urgent, commanding, a woman's trembling, breaking, then silence. A silence thick and suffocating. Maigret crossed the street and pushed the door open. The bell gave its thin metallic chime. Inside, Vernou stood rigid behind the counter, his face white, his eyes fixed on the back room. Lachaume was there, his coat still on, leaning over Yvette with an expression both furious and pleading. Her hands were pressed to her chest, her eyes wide with terror. The inspector removed his hat, set it calmly on the counter, and filled the room with pipe smoke. His presence was like a weight settling into the air. Neither spoke at first. It was Maigret's silence that pressed hardest of all. Lachaume straightened, forcing a laugh that rang hollow. "Inspector, a misunderstanding. I was only speaking with Madame." Maigret said nothing. He let the silence spread until the man's smile faltered. Yvette's eyes darted toward him, brimming with desperation, as if she could no longer hold the secret. Her lips parted, but no words came. The inspector's voice, when it came, was low and steady. "Enough." The word cut through the room like a blade. Yvette crumpled into the chair behind her, covering her face with her hands. A sob escaped her, raw and broken. Vernou moved as if to go to her, then stopped, paralyzed by confusion. Lachaume shifted his weight, his composure slipping. "It is nothing," he muttered again, but the silence swallowed him. The smoke curled between them, heavy and patient. He could not fill it with words. Maigret did not accuse, did not shout. He only stood there, immense and calm, his eyes fixed on the man until the truth weighed too heavily to be denied. The silence in the little shop seemed almost physical, pressing down on the three figures inside until none could draw a free breath. Maigret stood motionless, his great shoulders filling the doorway of the back room, the glow of his pipe the only light that seemed steady. Lachaume tried again to summon his smile, that brittle armor of men who survive by charm, but it faltered under the inspector's unblinking gaze. His eyes darted from Yvette, weeping softly with her face in her hands, to Vernou, stiff as a figure carved from wax, and back to Maigret. "I told you, Inspector," he said, his voice thin now. "It is nothing. A private matter between acquaintances. I was leaving when you arrived." But he did not move toward the door. He stood frozen, as though the inspector's silence had bound him where he was. Yvette's sobs grew louder, the small shop filling with the sound of a woman undone. Vernou finally stirred, his lips parting in confusion. "What is this?" he whispered, more to himself than to anyone else. He had suspected, but suspicion is easier to live with than truth. Now the pieces shifted before his eyes. and he could not stop them from forming a shape he dreaded. Yvette lifted her face then, pale and streaked with tears. "I cannot, Georges," she said to her husband, her voice breaking. "I cannot hide it any more." Her gaze flicked to Lachaume, then dropped back to her hands. "He has come back. He never left me in peace. I thought it was over when I married you, but he reminds me, always he reminds me." Vernou staggered as though struck. His hands trembled, gripped the edge of the counter. "This man," he choked, "this man is the reason?" Lachaume stepped forward, desperate now, trying to reclaim control. "She exaggerates. It is nothing. A misunderstanding from years ago. She owes me nothing. I only came to speak, to clarify." His words dissolved under the weight of Maigret's silence. The inspector puffed slowly on his pipe, eyes heavy-lidded, his expression unreadable. He knew that words spoken too quickly were the most false. He let them die in the air. Yvette's voice rose again, raw. "No, do not twist it. You have bled me for years. Small sums, little by little. Money, I said, was for the shop, for household needs. And when I could not give more, you sent the letter. That terrible letter. A page without words, but it was enough. Enough to remind me that you would never let me go." Her body sagged into the chair, her hands clutching her apron. Vernou stared at her, uncomprehending, his lips trembling. His eyes moved to Maigret as if the inspector might explain the unexplainable. "It is true," he whispered. Maigret exhaled smoke, slow and deliberate. "It is true enough," he said in his deep voice. "The letter was not for you, Monsieur Vernou. It was for your wife. A reminder, as she says. A reminder of a hold he still wished to keep." The shopkeeper's face crumpled, a mix of fury and humiliation. He lurched toward Lachaume, his fists clenched, but stopped short when Maigret's great hand lifted, calm but commanding. The inspector's presence filled the space, stilling the storm before it broke into violence. Vernou's breath came hard, his chest heaving. Lachaume's composure was gone now. He tried to laugh, but it was a hollow sound, dry in his throat. "What is it you think you have, Inspector? A blank page? A few tears? There is no crime in paper." "No," Maigret said evenly. "No crime in paper, but enough to show who you are, enough to let others see the pattern you leave behind. Men who live on appearances, men who remind, who press, who do not let go. And enough to make a woman collapse in the street, because the silence is heavier than words, heavier than words." Yvette gave a low cry, burying her face again. Vernou's eyes, bloodshot and wild, fixed on her with a mixture of pain and disbelief. He spoke in a hoarse voice. "Why didn't you tell me?" She lifted her head, her tears shining. "Because I was ashamed. Because I thought it would end on its own. Because I did not want you to see me through him." The words seemed to drain her. She slumped forward, her shoulders shaking. Lachaume shifted uneasily, glancing toward the door as if calculating escape. But Maigret's stillness held him where he was. The inspector's bulk, the calm certainty in his eyes, had more weight than force could ever muster. After a long silence, Maigret spoke again, his tone as calm as if they were discussing the weather. "You will come with me, Monsieur Lachaume. Not because of the letter alone. Because of the pattern. Because your life is nothing but debts you pay with other people's dignity. That is its own crime in time." Lachaume's face hardened, the smile gone entirely. He looked for a moment as though he might protest, but no words came. He lowered his eyes, his shoulders sagging. The fight left him all at once. Maigret turned his gaze to Vernou and Yvette. The husband stood stiffly, his face grey, his eyes hollow with the weight of betrayal. The wife sat slumped, trembling, emptied by confession. For a moment none moved. The inspector let the silence fill the shop once more, not cruelly, but with the inevitability of rain falling on stone. Finally he placed his hat back on his head, knocked the ashes from his pipe into the stove, and gestured toward the door. "Come," he said simply to Lachaume. The man obeyed without resistance, his steps heavy. Outside the drizzle had thickened into rain. Maigret walked beside him, his coat collar turned up, his hand loosely gripping the man's arm. Not tightly, not needing to. The silence between them was punishment enough. At the Quai des Orfèvres, the lamps glowed dim in the damp air. Clerks glanced up as the inspector entered with his prisoner, then quickly lowered their eyes. It was not an arrest that needed shouting. It was only another thread of Parisian life pulled taut until it broke. Later, when the papers were signed and Lachaume left in custody, Maigret sat alone in his office. The blank letter lay before him again. its silence now complete. He poured himself a small glass of beer from the bottle he kept in the cupboard, lit his pipe, and let the smoke drift upward. He thought of Yvette's collapse, of Vernoux's trembling hands, of the way human frailty always revealed itself not in great gestures, but in small silences, half-truths and the breaking of voices. He did not feel triumph, only the same weary compassion that came with every case, compassion for ordinary people caught in snares of their own making. When he returned home that night, Madame Maigret looked up from her knitting. "It is finished?" she asked. "Yes," he said simply, removing his coat. She nodded, poured his beer, and set it before him. They ate quietly, listening to the rain outside, the city settling into its endless rhythm. For Maigret the silence was no longer heavy. It was only Paris breathing as it always did, indifferent and eternal. The rain softened again during the night, and by morning, Paris lay under a thin veil of mist that blurred the outlines of buildings and dulled the colors of the street. Maigret awoke later than usual, the heaviness of the past days still pressing on him. He dressed slowly, the thick wool of his coat comforting in the chill, and sat for a long while at the kitchen table while Madame Maigret set out the bread and coffee. She did not ask questions. She never did in the mornings after a case. She knew her husband's silence was not distance, but the last turning over of thoughts before they settled. He lit his pipe, staring at the steam rising from the cup. The letter was gone now, filed away with the case at the quay, but its silence lingered in his mind. A blank page, no words, no ink, only a reminder. It was enough to unravel the fragile balance of an ordinary life. He thought of Yvette's trembling hands, her voice breaking as she confessed. He thought of Vernoux, stiff and pale, humiliated by what he had not seen, and of Lachaume, the smooth suit and polished shoes concealing the empty pockets and the hollow hunger. No masterminds, no evil genius, only loneliness, shame, and the quiet cruelty of a man who pressed his advantage. After breakfast, he walked slowly through the damp streets toward the Seine. The city carried on as always. Carts rattled past, their wheels sending up spray from the puddles. Children in caps ran to school, their satchels bouncing on their backs. Café doors swung open with the smell of coffee and wine drifting out. Life went on, indifferent to one woman's tears, one man's disgrace, one parasite's downfall. That was the truth of Paris and the truth of his work. The city absorbed everything. At the Quai des Orfèvres, the corridors were noisy again, typewriters clacking, clerks shouting across offices. Papers waited on his desk, new reports, small crimes demanding attention. He signed them with his heavy pen, not thinking too much about the words. His thoughts drifted instead to the shop by the canal. He wondered if Vernoux had opened that morning, if the window display looked the same, if Yvette had found the courage to stand beside her husband after what had broken between them. Perhaps they would endure silently, because life demanded it. Perhaps not. That was no longer his concern. In the afternoon, Janvier came in with a report on Lachaume. "He's been charged, Chief. Extortion, fraud, unpaid debts. They'll keep him. He won't trouble them again." Maigret only nodded, tamping the ash in his pipe. "He will trouble someone," he said quietly. "Men like him always do, but not them." Janvier hesitated, then asked, "And the Vernoux couple?" The inspector exhaled smoke, slow and steady. "They will live on. Perhaps together, perhaps apart. That is for them, not us." The young inspector nodded, though his brow furrowed. He still looked for neat endings, for justice delivered like a balance restored. Maigret knew better. Life did not tie itself neatly. It frayed and tangled, and one did what one could with the threads. That evening he left earlier than usual. He walked home through the mist, stopping once at a café for a glass of beer. He sat at the window, watching the lamps glow dimly through the haze, their reflections trembling in the wet pavement. He thought again of the blank letter, how such a small thing could unravel lives, but it was never the paper itself. It was what it carried in silence, a past that could not be erased, a debt that would not vanish, a shame that would not be forgotten. The letter only gave form to what already weighed on Yvette's heart. When he reached home, Madame Maigret greeted him with her usual quiet warmth. She set a pot of stew on the table, poured his beer, and sat across from him with her knitting. He ate slowly, the day's damp still clinging to his clothes, the smoke from his pipe curling upward as if in thought. Afterward, he stretched out in his armchair, pipe glowing faintly, and listened to the rhythm of the needles clicking, the soft rustle of wool. He felt the weariness of the case settle into something gentler. There had been no dramatic revelations, no chase, no shouts of triumph, only silence, then sobs, then the quiet unraveling of a truth that had weighed too heavily to be borne. That was enough. He thought of all the years behind him, of the many times he had sat just so after a case. Always the same pattern. The waiting, the watching, the silences heavier than words, and then the moment when a man or woman could no longer hold themselves together. He had learned to trust that moment, to know it would come if he was patient enough. And it always did. Madame Maigret looked up once from her knitting, her eyes warm. "You are tired," she said softly. He smiled faintly. "Yes, but it will pass." They sat in silence, the comfort of their domestic life wrapping around him like a blanket. Outside the rain began again, soft against the windows, steady and unremarkable. The city breathed in its endless rhythm, absorbing one more sorrow, one more broken silence, one more human frailty among thousands. And Maigret, pipe in hand, let the sound of the rain carry him deeper into thought. He was not thinking of justice or triumph, only of people, ordinary, fragile, caught in their own nets, weaving and unweaving the threads of their lives. He had seen it all before, and he would see it again. Paris was full of blank letters, some written, some never opened, each one waiting for its silence to break. The inspector leaned back, the glow of his pipe fading. He closed his eyes, listening to the rain, and allowed himself to rest. The rain had stopped at last, leaving the air heavy with dampness, the streets glistening in the weak afternoon light. At the Quai des Orfèvres, Maigret sat at his desk, pipe in hand, staring at the last remnants of the case file. The blank letter lay inside, now little more than evidence, but its silence lingered in his mind. It had started everything, a page without words, yet louder than any accusation. Lachaume was gone now, held in custody, his charm and polished exterior stripped bare. The official charge was extortion and fraud, debts stretching across the city like a spider's web. Nothing elegant, nothing clever, just a man feeding off the weaknesses of others until he finally pressed too far. It had ended as it always did, with the truth seeping through cracks, not in a dramatic confession, but in a collapse, a voice breaking under the weight of silence too long endured. Yvette Vernou had wept until she could speak no more. Her husband had stood beside her, grey-faced and bewildered, a man who had thought his life orderly, his shop safe, only to find it riddled with shadows he had never seen. Whether they would stay together, whether their marriage could survive the revelation, Maigret did not know. It was not his business. People carried on in ways no police file could record. Some endured in silence, others broke apart quietly, leaving no trace in the records of justice. As evening fell, Maigret left his office and walked slowly through the damp streets. The city was alive again, indifferent as always. Lovers hurried under umbrellas. Children splashed through puddles. Café doors swung open with the smell of wine and stew spilling out. Life moved on, swallowing the sorrow of one household without pause. He stopped at a café near the Pont Neuf, his usual place, and sat by the window with a glass of beer. He watched the lamps flicker on, their reflections trembling on the wet pavement. He thought of the blank letter, how such a small silent thing could unravel so much. But it was never the letter itself. It was the memories it stirred, the shame it recalled, the debts it demanded. The page had been empty, but for Yvette it had been filled with everything she feared most. Maigret smoked slowly, letting the beer rest cool in his hand. He felt no triumph, no satisfaction, only the same weary compassion he always carried after such cases. People were fragile, ordinary, carrying burdens too heavy for their shoulders. They hid them in silence until silence itself became unbearable. Then they collapsed, and he was there to witness it, to gather the pieces, to nod and smoke and listen until the truth emerged. He finished his beer, left a few coins on the table, and walked home through the mist. Madame Maigret was waiting with supper, her knitting folded neatly on the chair beside her. She looked up as he entered, her expression calm, knowing. "It is over?" she asked. "Yes," he said, removing his coat. She nodded and poured his beer. They ate in silence, the comfortable silence of years shared, the silence that was not heavy but warm. When he settled into his chair afterward, pipe glowing faintly, He felt the weight of the case slip from him, leaving only the quiet ache of understanding. Outside, the rain began again, soft against the windows. The city breathed in its endless rhythm, indifferent, eternal, full of blank letters waiting to be opened, full of lives waiting to break under silence. And Maigret, weary and patient, would be there to listen when they did.